The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, he'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
The High Peak series is sponsored by Gainsborough Cycles, 01427 617 752. For all your cycling needs, this is your one-stop shop located at 20 Ropery Road, Gainsborough, or online at gainsboroughcycles.com. There's a link in the description. Gainsborough Cycles, ask for Trevor Halstead. Welcome back to High Peak, everybody, for round 3 this week. Now, this particular parish is very, very complicated. I've got loads of things to talk about in this one. It's spread out pretty much all over the place, and there's loads of little hamlets with all different bits of history to talk about. I'm currently standing in a place called Peakdale, and this has a connection to the Buxton lime industry. Welcome to the parish of Wormhill. Wormhill, Wormers Hill. Today in High Peak, we're working our way back to the east again briefly as we encounter a run of villages and hamlets that form the parish of Wormhill. This one's quite a complicated parish, all things considered. It extends from the fringes of Buxton in the west to High Peak's border with the Derbyshire Dales in the east, and it takes in a whole raft of interesting bits and bobs. One of the places within Wormhill is Peakdale, where a railway station was once sited. There was another station at Millersdale in the east, as well as a huge viaduct which still stands today. Wormhill Parish also includes Tunstead, which was the birthplace of James Brindley, a pioneer builder of some of the canals we've seen and will see in the future on TVI. Brindley now has 2 memorials, and we'll see both in this video. Tunstead also has a huge limestone quarry just to the south of Doveholes. In the hamlet of Hargate is the former home of the industrialist Robert Whitehead, and the house that once belonged to him and the notorious mill owner Ellis Needham. All of that is before we've even begun to discuss Wormhill itself, which by the way has nothing to do with worms. There was a tradition of wolf hunting in Wormhill in the 14th century. It was said that a living was made by some thanks to it, and that an annual tribute of wolf heads was shown within the village. Historians reckon the last wolf ever killed in England was at Wormhill Hall in the 15th century. So in all, this one's very varied. We'd better get going because there's so much to cover. Kicking off the parish of Wormhill, we have the small village of Peakdale, located just to the south of Doveholes Quarry, where we left off yesterday. Peakdale is perhaps the largest of all the settlements in Wormhill Parish. It's definitely larger than the main village. The reason for its size is all to do with the quarries of the Buxton lime industry. Peakdale was built to house quarry workers and their families, but some of its original houses have now been demolished. It lies in and slightly to the north of an area known as the Great Rocks Dale. Until the middle of the 19th century, this was an area of sparsely populated moorland, its history closely linked with that of Wormhill to the southeast. During the 1800s, in response to the country's demand for limestone, quarries were developed along both Doveholes Dale and Great Rocks Dale. We already know quite a lot about Doveholes from yesterday's video. As nearby hamlets increased in size to accommodate the workmen and their families who came to the area, Peakdale emerged as a village in its own right. The name Peakdale has only been in use since 1893. Before that date, the hamlets of Doveholes Dale, Tunstead Great Rocks, Upper End and Bibbington dotted the land surrounding Great Rocks Dale, and together they were known as Peak Forest Hamlets. The name was changed to Peakdale to avoid confusion with Peak Forest itself, which is 2.5 miles away to the north. Of those scattered hamlets, Doveholes Dale for many years formed the focal point of Peakdale and the quarrying industry, but its upper end, which forms the nucleus of the village as we know it today. So what's in the village now then? Well, there's a sports ground, a playground and a cemetery, but the 3 main things would be Holy Trinity Church, the Great Rocks Club and the primary school. This is the Great Rocks Club, a social club which acts as both a village hall and a local pub. It's a bit of an all-in-one sort of job. Holy Trinity Church was founded in 1886, but it's now closed. It was a chapel of ease to Wormhill and once had its own reading room. The church has been closed since 2003 and its memorials are currently stored in St Margaret's in Wormhill itself. It cost around £1,500 to build. Its pulpit, reading desk, communion table and lectern were given by a member of the Bagshaw family in memory of the Reverend E.B. Bagshaw, who was for 36 years the rector of Eyam. As for the school, that's still going. Peakdale School's history goes back to 1895 when the first thing to be constructed was an infant school building. This early school included a kitchen, a store, cloakrooms, a toilet and the present hall. By 1899 the school had enough space for 300 children and an average attendance of 200. There's nowhere near that many here today, but Peakdale School remains the only school in the parish of Wormhill. Let's drive on now towards the next settlement in the parish, Tunstead. In doing so, we'll pass over a railway, which in actual fact is well worth stopping to have a look at. Let's see why. It was here, on this stretch of railway line, where the former Peak Forest railway station was located. It served Peakdale, Smalldale and Peak Forest when it was active. Peak Forest Station was opened in 1867 by the Midland Railway on its extension of the Manchester, Buxton, Matlock and Midlands Junction Railway from Rowsley. It was part of the main Midland line from Manchester London Road to London St Pancras. It was also the northern junction for the line from Buxton and marked its summit before it dropped through Doveholes Tunnel to Chapel-on-the-Frith. It closed in 1967 and the platforms were demolished shortly afterwards, although a short section of one platform has been reinstated for railway staff. The northbound station building still survives as offices which support a large quarry terminal close by. The line itself is still in use. The main users of it now are stone freight trains serving the Buxton lime industry. For that reason, it's often known as the Great Rocks Line. Historically, this area marked the southern end of the Peak Forest Tramway too. Built by Benjamin Outram, the tramway was initially single track and had a gauge of 4 foot 2 inches, the very same as the one used by the Little Eaton Gangway in Erewash. That episode's well worth checking out, by the way. The rails were provided by the Benjamin Outram Company, who also supplied the mineral wagons, and they too would have been similar to the ones used at Little Eaton. The tramway was built to serve the massive Doveholes quarry and to provide a link between that and the Peak Forest Canal at Buxworth. The tramway closed in 1920 and its rails and wagons were sold by LNER. The most important surviving features of the tramway are at Bugsworth Basin, Stodhart Tunnel and an inclined plane at Chapel-on-the-Frith. So all things considered, as far as Peakdale goes, if it was a parish in its own right, it would be a cracking little episode. But of course it's part of Wormhill and there's plenty more to cover in this one yet. Let's hop into the car again now as we head towards Tunstead. Now this place has a quarry, but also a memorial to a very famous person. Now we're coming into Tunstead, a tiny hamlet between Peakdale and Hargatewell. It should not be confused with Tunstead Milton, which is roughly 5 miles to the northwest. It forms part of the Great Roxdale, and just like Dove Holes, it has a quarry. More on that shortly. Tunstead also has a memorial to its most famous son, born here in 1716. His name was James Brindley, and he has a second memorial in Wormhill village. Brindley was born on a farm which by 1875 had fallen into ruins. The site of it was marked only by an ash tree. By 1958, even the ash tree had also gone, and the Derbyshire Archaeological Society planted a sapling in its place and erected another monument. So, who was James Brindley? Long-time viewers will have heard his name before, both in Derbyshire and in other areas of the country, but can you remember who he was? Let's find out. James Brindley was a pioneer builder of Britain's canals. Although he was born in Tunstead, he lived most of his life in the Staffordshire town of Leek. Being a native of the Peak District, he received very little in the way of a formal education and was instead educated at home by his mother. Having completed an apprenticeship with a millwright at the age of 17, he set up business for himself as a wheelwright in Leek. In 1750, he expanded his business by renting a millwright shop in Burslem from the Wedgwoods, who became his lifelong friends. He soon established a reputation for ingenuity and skill at repairing many different kinds of machinery. In 1752, he designed and built an engine for draining the wet earth colliery at Clifton in Manchester. 3 years later, he built a machine for a silk mill at Congleton. It wasn't long before he was turning his hand to the canal network. Brindley's reputation brought him to the attention of the 3rd Duke of Bridgwater, who was looking for a way to improve the transport of coal from his mines. In 1759, the Duke commissioned the construction of a canal to do just that. The result was the Bridgwater Canal, which we walked along in Dunham Massey 2 years ago. It opened in 1761 and is often regarded as the first British canal of the modern era. A major technical triumph, Brindley was commissioned as the consulting engineer. However, although Brindley has often been credited as the genius behind the construction of the canal, it's thought that its main designers were the Duke himself and the engineer John Gilbert. Brindley was engaged at the insistence of Gilbert to assist with particular problems, such as the Barton Aqueduct. Brindley's canal building technique minimised the amount of earth that needed to be moved by developing the principle of contouring. He preferred to use a circuitous route that avoided embankments and opted for tunnels rather than cuttings. In some cases, it meant his canals were often much longer than they perhaps should have been. His greatest contribution to the canal network was the technique of puddling clay. That produced a watertight clay-based material, and to this day it's still used to line canals. By around 1840, puddle clay was widely used as the water-retaining element or core within earth-filled dams, particularly in the Pennines. Brindley later extended the Bridgwater Canal to Runcorn, connecting it to his next major work, the Trent and Mersey Canal. It was this that would lead to the invention of the modern canal lock and the Humble narrowboat, an elongated version of the boats designed for the underground system at Worsley. Brindley believed it was possible to use canals to link the 4 great rivers of England, the Mersey, the Trent, the Severn, and the Thames. This idea was referred to as the Grand Cross Scheme. The Trent and Mersey Canal was the first part of this ambitious network, and the Chester Canal, started in 1772, was a component. However, although Brindley and his assistants surveyed the whole potential system, he didn't live to see it completed. In total, throughout his life, Brindley built 365 miles of British canal and many watermills too. The old watermill at Leek is now the Brindley Water Museum. Here's a bit about Tunstead Quarry, which the hamlet sits within the shadow of. Because Tunstead used to be just outside the boundary of the Peak District National Park, the quarry was, historically, the most extensively worked in the area, yielding high-quality limestone exceptionally free of volcanic rock. It's been quarrying limestone since 1929, and most of it quarried today was formed from the skeletons of marine organisms and shells left behind by the huge Carboniferous sea that once covered this area. When water levels dropped, the rock was left behind. Limestone from Tunstead was quite often used to supply the chemical industries of the Mersey Valley. This makes sense. Because the limestone is of a really high quality, it's suitable for chemical-grade lime. So as you can imagine, the demand for its limestone was pretty big. In the mid-1970s, 1973 to be exact, Tunstead was the largest quarry in Europe. The quarry was extended into the Peak District National Park after a High Court case, and although it still works today, there are limits now on what can be extracted. That said, Tunstead is still a vital piece of the Buxton lime industry. Next up, we have some more driving to do, and we're heading for Wormhill village now. Before we get to that, we have to pass through the hamlet of Hargate or Hargatewell. This one has one major landmark, the historic Hargate Hall, built in 1899 by its original owner, Joseph Wainwright. During its construction, the ownership changed to Robert Whitehead. The building was completed, in fact, under Whitehead's stewardship, with some additions to the original plans. When he took over Hargate Hall, he added an extra storey to the tower above the front door, as well as a coach house. He also added the lodge, stables, orangery, and a potting shed. So who was Robert Whitehead? He must have been quite a wealthy man on that evidence. He was, you know. He was a successful businessman with multiple interests. He was perhaps best known as being an ex-sheriff of Derbyshire and the deputy chairman of the Staveley Coal and Iron Company. He was also the chairman of Benger's Food Company. You could say he had his fingers in a lot of pies, literally. He came from a well-known family and was a second cousin to another Robert Whitehead, the man who invented the torpedo. Hargate Hall is now owned by Anthony and Julie Knox. The building has been carefully renovated into a wedding venue and self-catering accommodation. It maintains many of its original features, such as the large wooden staircase that runs through the property. This family-run business is well known across Derbyshire. Now, Hargatewell once had another famous resident, the notorious mill owner Ellis Needham. The Needham family were a long-established family in the Peak District. Indeed, when Peak Forest was an actual forest with trees and all that jazz, a branch of the family were its foresters. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the family had interests in farming, the sale of lead, and the manufacture of textiles. Robert Needham and his son were largely responsible for building up the family's estates in Chapel-on-Frith, Ashford, Peak Forest and Tideswell. However, the family fortune was accrued over 2 generations and then spectacularly wasted by Ellis Needham through the failure of his cotton mill at Litton. Litton became notorious during the Industrial Revolution for its unsavoury employment practices, luridly described by the commentators of the day. It was set up in 1792 by Needham and Thomas Frith, a farmer with a small estate in the area. The mill was powered by the water of the River Wye, using Richard Arkwright's water frame. It could be said that the company, though, was doomed from the start. Needham, in particular, had sunk most of his assets into the venture. The valley was particularly isolated, and transport for the raw material and finished goods was poor. Moreover, they had difficulty in attracting a workforce. By 1786, the barely profitable mill was put up for sale. There were no buyers, but Needham struggled on despite the fact his money had gone and he was farming on rented land. Frith left the partnership in 1799. By 1815, Needham was bankrupt and was given notice to quit. By 1828, he was a pauper. Let's move on to Wormhill Village. Okay, we've made it to Wormhill Village. We've done quite a lot of running around so far, and we've talked about a heck of a lot, and we haven't even got to the main walk yet. Well, this is the main walk, and it's not going to be much of one. Wormhill is a very small village and really only has a handful of landmarks. One of them, though, is related to James Brindley. The other one is the church. So we'd better get moving. We're going to start by taking a walk along a bridleway, which runs across this road that I'm currently standing on, goes around some houses, and brings us out at the church. Most of Wormhill is residential, but that doesn't mean it has nothing to talk about. Far from it, actually. I mean, for a start, it's surrounded by the most stunning Peak District countryside, and that ought to win it a few brownie points. Wormhill is an ancient settlement, mentioned in the Domesday Book, at which time it reportedly contained 20 acres of meadow. The name is originally thought to mean Wolf Hill, or it could also mean Wormers Hill. There's a case to be made for the former of those two theories. You see, the village has a rather grisly history of wolf hunting dating back to the 14th century. At that time, this part of the Peak District was within the Royal Forest of the Peak. The last wolf in England was reputedly killed at Wormhill Hall in the 15th century, and an annual display of wolf heads was made in the village. Wormhill's church was originally a medieval chapel built in around 1273. Although it looks far older, only the base of the church tower is medieval. The rest of the church was rebuilt in 1864. A new transept was then added between 1904 and 1910. All traces of the ancient chapel were lost during the rebuilding, which came 5 years after Wormhill was constituted an ecclesiastical parish. Undisturbed, however, are the remains of an ancient cross on the south side of the churchyard. Set into a stone base above 2 square steps, the shaft has long served time as a sundial. During the rebuilding, the low west tower was raised and surmounted by the most unique roof in the Peak District. Known as a German or Rhinish helm, its spire-like construction is formed from 4 diamond-shaped sides rising between the pointed gables of the tower walls. The design is thought to be an imitation of the Saxon Tower at Sampting in Sussex. Inside the new tower, a peal of 6 bells were hung, originally cast as trade samples by Taylor & Co of Loughborough. They are famed today for being the smallest peal in existence anywhere in the country. So that's the church here in Wormhill. The other major landmark this place has is the other James Brindley Memorial. There's obviously the one in Tunstead, but there's one here in Wormhill too, and it takes the form of a well, which is decorated every year. Here we have James Brindley's second memorial. It's a well. As part of the annual well dressing festival in the parish, this well, which is sometimes known as the Brindley Well thanks to the man it remembers, is decorated. It's nice when places give you a bit of a clue as to what they used to be thanks to their nameplate on a wall. Here you can see we've got Bagshaw Arms Farm, which means that building there was probably once the Bagshaw Arms pub. It's funny that, isn't it? And just in front of Bagshaw Arms Farm there's another stone set into a wall, which is quite interesting. This is in loving memory of John Furness of Bateman Farm. Now I've just come past Bateman Farm, it's on the other side of the road, and this says, "I farmed the land, I milked my cows, these are the things that made me proud. No grand schemes, they have passed me by, I knew my cows, the hills and sky." Rest in peace, John. We have one final place to cover, and this one should be familiar to most of the regular viewers. A long time ago we covered a parish in the Derbyshire Dales which included one half of Millersdale. The other half is not only within a different parish, but it's also over the border into High Peak. Okay, so lastly here in the parish of Wormhill is the other half of Millersdale, which you may remember from the Derbyshire Dales series quite a while ago. There are two main landmarks, three technically speaking, on this side of the border. One of them is the railway station, the other two are viaducts. The viaduct is perhaps the better known of the two railway related features in Millersdale. It was first built by the Midland Railway in 1866. Increasing traffic meant that a second viaduct parallel to the first was built in 1905, increasing the number of tracks here to 4. This was an exceptional section of railway, and the viaduct is the pinnacle of engineering marvel. It cut a route through the limestone landscape of the Wye Valley between Hassop and Buxton, demanding 8 tunnels totalling 2,426 yards, 2 major viaducts and a number of smaller ones in the space of just 11 miles. Millersdale is the most westerly of those 2 major viaducts, and it's adjacent to Millersdale Station, crossing the Wye at a height of around 80 feet. Elegant in design, the original comprises 2 parts, 3 30-foot masonry arches at its west end and a longer section to the east involving wrought iron segmental arches of 95 feet. The second viaduct was built to the north slightly, forming part of a 683-yard loop used by traffic on the fast lines. The new viaduct also has a masonry section, this time of 4 spans with the arches themselves in Staffordshire blue brick. Contracted to build the new viaduct were Whittaker Brothers of Leeds, with the steelwork erected by the Butterley Company. They took a little under 3 years. You see, engineering works moved fast in the 19th century. Time is money, and the Victorians knew it. Millersdale Station was located at the junction where passengers for Buxton joined or left the trains between London and Manchester. It was opened in 1863 and closed in 1967. The site is now used as a car park for the Monsal Trail, which follows the old trackbed. When it first came into operation, the station was supposed to be called Blackwell Mill, but was named Millersdale instead. From 1889 it became known as Millersdale for Tideswell. For such a rural location, it was unusually large. Indeed, it was one of the largest stations on the line and was one of the few stations in England to have a post office on its platform. Millersdale also sent dairy, agricultural and quarried products, the latterly mainly lime and limestone, from the surrounding areas to the major cities. Much of its activity was concerned with the connecting service to and from Buxton. Traffic for Buxton followed the main line north for nearly 2 miles before diverging at Millersdale Junction just east of Blackwell Mill Halt. Changing at Millersdale often involved a wait, and this fact led to the High Peak News in 1900 to refer to the station as Patience Junction. The station was later immortalised in the 1964 song Slow Train by Flanders and Swan. Bonus points if you can name the station in the East Riding series that also features in that song. Put your answers below. Unlike a train service at Millersdale Station, you don't have to have a lot of patience for the next episode. Tomorrow we're back off towards Buxton. The Buxton lime industry, as we know, was and still is quite prominent out here. However, there is another, and you will at some point have bought something from your local supermarket which originated just outside the town. What could I be on about? Come back tomorrow and you'll find out. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.